Good morning. I'm pretty sure it's still morning. I'm Kate Van Hook, and my voice has had other places to be for the past several days, so I'm afraid this is going to be a slightly raspy presentation on the moral responsibility of civil disobedience. On a cold day in December 1953, at the end of a workday, a 42-year-old woman named Rosa Parks boarded a Montgomery City bus and sat down in the middle, in the section labeled as colored. A local ordinance required that the buses be segregated by race. Several stops later, the bus had filled to capacity and Parks was asked to yield her seat to a white passenger. She said later, "I thought of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy who was lynched after he was accused of offending a white woman in her family's grocery store, whose killers were tried and acquitted, and I just couldn't go back." She refused to yield her seat and was subsequently arrested. She was charged with both violation of a local ordinance and disorderly conduct. Outrage at Rosa Parks' arrest sparked the Montgomery bus boycott. For over a year, approximately 40,000 black bus riders refused to participate in the Montgomery City bus system. In December of 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that bus segregation was illegal under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The success of the Montgomery bus boycott led to an increase in civil rights protests across the nation. Civil rights leaders staged sit-ins and public demonstrations protesting segregation laws. Approximately 3,000 black protesters were jailed in Birmingham in 1963 alone, many of them children. But their efforts were successful in the end. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 made illegal all discrimination on the basis of race or color. Their organized civil disobedience led to a monumental change in American society. Today, no one would say Rosa Parks was wrong to refuse to yield her seat, but at the time she was widely criticized not only by segregationists, but by white anti-segregation activists who believed that violation of the law, even when that law is racist or unjust, is always wrong. Civil disobedience is defined as the nonviolent refusal to comply with the law as a form of protest. Many believe that civil disobedience is inherently unjust, often as a result of conflating legality with morality. If an action is illegal, they suggest it must not be morally justifiable. But the question of whether or not civil disobedience is a just action brings up a greater question, one that has been the source of debates throughout history. What is justice? This question is at the center of Plato's Republic. In this hypothetical dialogue, a man named Glaucon asked Socrates whether it is better to be just and thought unjust or unjust and thought just. The perfectly unjust man, who is believed to be just by everyone around him, is rewarded with wealth and titles. He is beloved and adored. The perfectly just man, who is believed to be unjust by everyone around him, lives a life of misery. He is scorned and despised, punished for crimes he did not commit. Still, Socrates says it is better to be just and thought unjust, because justice is a virtue that brings happiness not merely out of its results, but out of the pursuit of justice itself. Like the man who is believed to be unjust, those who practice civil disobedience are often characterized as unruly and wrong, but their actions are grounded in a respect for the law and for morality. According to political philosopher Beryl Lang, for a person's action to be qualified as civil disobedience, it must meet three criteria. Their act must violate the law, it must be performed intentionally as a violation of the law, and they must anticipate and accept punitive legal measures taken against them as a result of that act. Both civil disobedience is a form of nonviolent resistance, but not all nonviolent resistance must meet these three criteria. Both civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance are most often used to refer to mass organized actions, such as the sit-ins staged at segregated places of business during the civil rights movement, but can also refer to the actions of a single individual, such as Rosa Parks. Both civil and nonviolent refer to actions that do not seek to harm or injure another person. Acts resulting in harm to or destruction of property can be classified as civil disobedience or nonviolent resistance. By the end of the Republic, Socrates defines justice as knowing and doing what is right at all times to the best of one's ability. Importantly, he applies this principle not only to individuals, but to states and governments. But by answering the question of what justice is, Socrates raises an equally important question. How is a just and moral individual to respond to injustice in government? For justice-minded people throughout history, from Christians of the first century church to Henry David Thoreau to the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., the answer is clear. The moral response to governmental injustice is conscientious civil disobedience. The civil rights movement is far from a historical outlier in this. One historian detailed patterns of protest he observed in his own lifetime by saying, protesters stage marches from one place of symbolic significance to another. They chant slogans, both advocating their cause and denigrating their opponents. They perform petty acts of vandalism, such as destroying doors, windows, and street signs. They loot houses and stores of valuable objects, or in the case of food riots, of basic staples. And finally, they are attacked by representatives of the government, such as police, soldiers, or militia. These actions, he says, are all familiar enough to require little further elaboration. This description comes not from movements of the 20th or 21st century, but from ancient Rome. Responding to governmental injustice with organized civil disobedience is one of history's few constants. In A People's History of Riots, Protests, and the Law, Dr. Matthew Clement, a criminology professor at the Royal Holloway University of London, details successful movements of organized noncompliance throughout history, from ancient Athens to today. In medieval England, he says, for example, because the common people governed so many aspects of everyday life, it was natural for them to see law and order as a part of this. And so any act that threatened common customs and local democracy was itself a criminal act which should be countered with community action. For medieval Europeans, the goal of the law was to protect the customs of the people. So when the law failed to do so, civil disobedience was seen not as a violation of the law, but a protection of just law and order. American colonists viewed themselves similarly in the years leading up to the Revolutionary War. They viewed the acts imposed upon them by the British colonies as a violation of their rights as British citizens and responded with organized civil disobedience. The most famous of these efforts culminated when a group of colonist patriots boarded several British trading ships and dumped 240 chests of tea, today worth around $3 million, into the Boston harbor. This event, immortalized in history as the Boston Tea Party, is not unique in its tactics. As the Roman historian points out, vandalism of the property of the class being resisted is a common hallmark of civil disobedience. Suffragettes in both England and the United States chained themselves to the fences of private homes of government leaders, smashed windows, and set fire to post boxes. College campus protests, from the anti-Vietnam War protests of the 1960s to the Gaza Solidarity movements of 2023 and 2024, have involved the takeover of campus buildings. Other movements have embodied the same nonviolent non-cooperation of the civil rights movement. Mahatma Gandhi, whose efforts for Indian independence inspired Martin Luther King Jr.'s principle of civil disobedience, argued that a government is legitimate only so long as we, the common citizens, consider ourselves your subjects. When we are not subjects, you are not sovereign either. So long as you endeavor to control us with justice and love, we will let you do so. But if you wish to strike at us from behind, we cannot permit it. Throughout history, civil disobedience has been understood as the true pursuit of justice and order when faced with an unjust government. Dr. Clement argues that whenever the common people assembled, their motivation is fueled by a sense of injustice, creating a need to muster strength in numbers in order to respond to the tyranny of a ruler whose acts of violence constituted a threat to their well-being. Henry David Thoreau puts it most aptly when he states in his essay, Resistance to Civil Government, that all men recognize the right of revolution, that is, the right to refuse allegiance to and resist the government when its tyranny or its inefficiency are great and unendurable. Civil disobedience's greater success compared to other methods of protest is no coincidence. If policies in government have become unjust, legal means of advocating for change have likely been corrupted as well. In his book, Civil Disobedience, Professor William Sherman argues that in well-functioning liberal democracies, political changes should be made via normal lawmaking channels, and those seeking legal or policy changes should not feel motivated to violate the law in personally risky ways. But it is no longer clear that many liberal democracies are sufficiently well-functioning. In an inherently corrupt and broken world, where even nations with the purest of intentions will become unjust, civil disobedience exists to ensure that justice can be pursued in an unjust government. Still, consistent historical prevalence does not necessarily determine whether or not an action is acceptable. In his essay on a moral right to civil disobedience, David Lefkowitz argues that citizens of a liberal democratic state enjoy a moral right to engage in suitably constrained acts of civil disobedience. Many people, Lefkowitz claims, believe civil disobedience is inconsistent with the duty usually thought to correlate to a legitimate state's right to rule, namely a moral duty to obey the law. Civil disobedience is often conflated with rioting and other forms of violent political resistance, but peaceful political noncompliance is actually born out of a high regard for the law. Those who engage in democratic civil disobedience believe that the law and government exist to ensure justice and protect the inalienable rights of all people, and they expect government to hold itself to that same standard. Lefkowitz states that respect for persons as autonomous agents also requires that the state establish a moral right to public disobedience on the part of its citizens. The right to civil disobedience, then, is an inalienable right in itself, one that upholds the dignity of human beings and allows them to pursue justice. For those in pursuit of justice, then, civil disobedience is not only a moral right, but a moral responsibility. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail is addressed to white church leaders who believed that the principles of civil disobedience seen in the civil rights movement were opposed to their beliefs regarding the responsibility of Christians in the face of injustice. But when his methods were called extreme, Dr. King responded, "Was not Jesus an extremist in love?" To engage in civil disobedience, according to Dr. King, was to follow the example set by Scripture. Direct nonviolent action, he said, was seen sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to refuse to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar because a higher moral law was involved. He also cited Christians of the first century church who, he said, believed they were a colony of heaven and had to obey the laws of God rather than man, and quoted St. Augustine in saying that an unjust law is no law at all. Professor Sherman agrees that the civil rights movement was deeply grounded in religion, adding that civil rights activists even made sure to wear their Sunday finest when protesting and facing arrest. Dr. King characterizes civil rights activists as young ministers of the gospel, courageously and nonviolently sitting at lunch counters and willingly going to jail for conscience's sake. Civil rights activists, of course, are not the only ones to believe that civil disobedience is a responsibility and a necessity for conscience's sake. When he was indicted in 1963 for protesting against South African apartheid, Nelson Mandela said that Black people of South Africa had been given a choice between accepting a permanent state of inferiority and resisting the government. For Mandela, no choice at all. When the alternative is choosing to remain in oppression, civil defiance is the only moral choice. Mandela famously concluded his speech by saying that ending apartheid was an ideal for which he was prepared to die. This should be the response of all people to injustice everywhere. No earthly law or convention supersedes the moral law that guides all right and wrong. Civil disobedience has proven time and time again to be a successful means of advocating for change, one that is deeply grounded in regard for the law. But while responding to legal injustice with violation of the law as a form of resistance is one of history's constants, so is responding to civil disobedience with criticism and condemnation. Detractors argue that it is both immoral and ineffective and can lead to more violent forms of political resistance, such as rioting. However, these arguments are not grounded in historical credibility at all. Civil disobedience, when grounded in a deep regard for justice and morality, leads to immense positive change. One recent example of a protest movement grounded in tactics of civil disobedience that has received these kind of criticisms is the British climate justice movement, Just Stop Oil. In 2022, Just Stop Oil received intense backlash after two protesters poured soup over one of Vincent van Gogh's famous sunflower paintings. In 2024, they received similar condemnation after two more protesters sprayed Stonehenge with orange paint. The protesters were arrested following both of these events. Sunflowers was specifically chosen because it was covered in glass, so the actual painting would remain unharmed, and the paint designed to attack Stonehenge was designed to be easy to remove from the stone. Still, Just Stop Oil received intense backlash following both of these stunts. In 2023, a climate justice website called earth.org released an article titled, Are Climate Justice Activists Reaching Too Far? The article specifically condemned Just Stop Oil's sunflower stunt, as well as similar stunts performed in Italy and France. Just Stop Oil and Earth.org share the same goals, ending reliance on fossil fuels and promoting climate justice. However, Earth.org criticized Just Stop Oil, calling their tactics unruly and unsafe. Just Stop Oil is not the first to receive criticism from those who nominally share their goals. For example, Carrie Chapman Catt, leader of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, was highly critical of Alice Paul, leader of the National Women's Party, for her tactics, which she believed to be unfeminine and isolating the men she believed needed to be brought to the suffrage cause. But while the NAWSA was only able to grant women's suffrage in 11 states over the course of 65 years through the legal channels it followed, within 11 years of the founding of the National Women's Party, suffrage was granted nationally. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from the Birmingham jail addresses similar criticisms, and when white church leaders called the demonstrations that took place in Birmingham protesting segregation laws unfortunate, he responded, "I would not hesitate to say that the so-called demonstrations taking place in Birmingham are unfortunate, but I would say in more emphatic terms that it is even more unfortunate that the white power structure has left the Negro community with no other alternative." To Dr. King, no one truly enraged with injustice would see civil disobedience as anything less than the necessary response. History agrees with Dr. King. Time and time again, those who practice civil disobedience are at first responded to with criticism and condemnation, but discussions soon turn from those regarding the methods of protest to the reason for protesting, and these movements begin to garner widespread support. Lefkowitz says in his essay that civil disobedience willingness to risk the state's imposition of various fines on them, as well as the anger of their fellow citizens, communicates their dedication to their cause in a way that other tactics might not. In short, no press is bad press. Detractors of civil disobedience also frequently argue that lawbreaking is inherently wrong. As the Earth.org article condemning Just Stop Oil put it, a violation of the rights afforded to politically active citizens. But civil disobedience is, in fact, the right of every citizen. In 1964, amid waves of civil rights and anti-war protests, political philosopher Charles Frankel addressed the argument that civil disobedience is always morally wrong by saying this: "To take this position is to say one of two things. Either every law that exists is a just law, or the greater wrong is always done by breaking the law. The first statement is plainly false. The second is highly doubtful. If it is true, then the signers of the Declaration of Independence, or those Germans who refused to carry out Hitler's orders, committed acts of injustice." Thomas Jefferson, in his writing of the Declaration of Independence, argued that when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such a government and to provide new guards for future security. And on a moral right to civil disobedience, Lefkowitz argues that in democratic states, citizens have not only a right to participate in the decision-making process itself, say by casting a vote in a majority rule procedure, but also the right to continue to contest the decision reached by a majority rule procedure by a variety of means, including suitably constrained civil disobedience. After all, oftentimes those who find themselves in the minority may justifiably complain that had there been further time for debate and deliberation, or had they enjoyed greater resources for the dissemination of their arguments, their own reasonable views might have won majority support. In the perfect liberal democracy, each citizen has the equal opportunity for political participation. However, in reality, every democratic process is limited by time constraints and procedural rules. A true liberal democracy, then, grants the right to civil disobedience as a remedy for the shortcomings of the state. Some Christians, however, argue that civil disobedience is immoral not for political reasons, but for religious ones. In Matthew 22, verse 21, after all, Christ commands, "Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's." However, Christ himself was crucified because he broke the law. For example, Jewish law forbade any working on the Sabbath, but Christ continued to heal the sick on the Sabbath. He declared, "What man shall there be among you that if you have one sheep and he fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? How much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath day." Christ declared that the action of compassion and justice, although it violated Jewish law, was actually the more lawful act. Paul too said, "Do we then make void the law through faith? Heaven forbid. No, we establish the law." Christianity is not a rejection of the principle of law. It is a calling to uphold a higher law. Christians establish the law by upholding the laws of God rather than man. Christian civil disobedience establishes God's law by rejecting unjust principles. At the same time, it honors the law of man by holding it to the proper standard of a law ordained by God. As St. Augustine said, an unjust law is no law at all. The argument that peaceful legal noncompliance can devolve into violent rioting, then, is completely removed from the context of morally grounded civil disobedience. Legal noncompliance is not a neutral tool that can be examined in a moral vacuum. It must be grounded in a calling to a higher standard of law. In civil disobedience, Professor Sherman argues that pro-fascism movements, for example, can never be considered proper civil disobedience, because a movement that advocates for an autocratic or dictatorial government system is inherently opposed to the democratic system of law upon which civil disobedience is based. Martin Luther King Jr. best described the importance of moral integrity in protest by saying this: "We must keep God in the forefront. let us be Christian in all our actions. On April 23rd, 2024, a group of Columbia students marched toward the university's Hamilton Hall. A student who was already inside the building opened the door and protesters rushed in. They barricaded the building with tables and chairs. They remained inside the building for 21 hours, unveiling a sign renaming the hall after a 6-year-old Palestinian girl who was killed by Israeli forces and demanding that the university divest from Israel. After 21 hours, the New York Police Department stormed the building. Protesters were hurled downstairs and smashed into barricades. 109 students were arrested. A survey from Winning the Issues found that 60% of voters believed the actions taken by Columbia student protesters to be more violent and dangerous than past student protests. However, this is simply untrue. All of the protest tactics seen in this, including the occupation of Hamilton Hall, can be seen in movements from nearly every decade. Hamilton Hall was taken over by students in 1996, in 1985, in 1972, in 1964. These movements led to Columbia being among the first universities to divest from apartheid South Africa and from the Vietnam War. It led to it halted the construction of a segregated building that Columbia was funding. It led to increased faculty and diversity in course offerings. Increased diversity in faculty and course offerings, whoopsie. But whether or not one agrees with the beliefs of the Columbia student protesters, to criticize their methods engages in a conversation that goes far beyond issues of political affiliation and robs ourselves of a valuable tool that has proved vital to challenging unjust and immoral practices for generations. Civil disobedience, when grounded in a deep regard for morality and the law, is a necessary and potent way of challenging injustice. Thank you. I'd like to open the floor for questions. Why did I clap for myself? Jeez, I am out of it today. I'd like to open the floor for questions and once again apologize for the scratchiness of my voice.
Kate, is there a topic, current or past, that you could see yourself personally being involved in a civil disobedience?
Try not to look at my parents. Hang on. Yes, and I end with what has generally been referred to in conversations regarding my paper as the Palestine thing, because a lot of the schools that I was looking at attending at the end of my junior year, like this was something that was going on, and it was something that I personally felt very passionate about, and it was this very weird feeling of like, I am 1 year removed from this. You know, if I were attending this school right now, would I be participating in this? And not looking at my parents, not looking at my parents, not looking at my parents. I think so, and I think that at some level, like, that is the purpose of this thesis. I don't believe that political apathy is a virtue, and I hope that everybody would have something that they would be willing to, as Lefkowitz put it, you know, invoke the anger of their fellow citizens as well as the imposition of the state because they care about it so deeply. Hi, Mr. Davis.
Hello. I have two questions. One similar to one I asked before, but are there any things that you think, instances where you've seen civil disobedience, you're like, that seems inappropriate? I'm just going to throw out January 6th as an opportunity for you, maybe.
All right. I think J6 is something that is mentioned in my actual paper that I removed from the spoken presentation because it's just such a charged issue for a lot of people. I think it's worth noting that the kind of general plans for J6 and like the talk of like storming the Capitol originated on like, you know, hate websites where it was being tossed around, you know, in equal consideration with, you know, assassinating congressmen and politicians. And a lot of the people who stormed the Capitol that day did so with the intent of harming people. So I don't think, based on my definition of civil disobedience, where it cannot, you know, include harm to or injury of a person, it qualifies at all. And this is where, again, civil disobedience is often falsely conflated with rioting and, you know, doing actual damage to human beings. Civil disobedience, true, proper civil disobedience, where the intent is to uphold the law to a higher standard and not hurt people, can't devolve in the way a riot intended on harming people can.
So my second question is interesting one, and maybe unfair to you because this happened in the last week relative to the Hamilton Hall incident. So janitors who were working in Hamilton Hall are suing the students because they were imprisoned and thrown several racial epithets, Jew hater, that kind of thing, Jew lover, that kind of thing. If you were in Hamilton Hall as a part of that, how do you think you would respond to that? Because that's the challenge, I think, in some of these civil disobedience protests, is that there are a lot of younger people who are doing it who are very passionate but may not have a huge perspective on justice.
Yeah, and you asked a similar question to this last time, just regarding specifically with this movement, with maybe anti-Semitism within the pro-Palestine movement. And I said last time that, of course, with any time there's a large group of people who assemble, there are going to be people with pure intentions and people with not. And I think it's fair to say that, not every college kid who decides to participate in a protest is going into it with the purest of intentions. I think it's fair to say that even the ones who were, don't necessarily have the complete political knowledge to approach every situation with the nuance it requires. But I also don't think that means the protest and the reasons for protesting and the discussions happening around it should be discarded entirely. It's at some point, the purpose of my thesis is to encourage you to see that this is why people engage in these methods, this is why people do this, and these are the conversations we need to be having around it. So were I there, then I'd hope I'd be hey, don't be mean. But beyond that, I don't think that the actions of individual students within that should lead you to disregard the entire thing.
Very good answer, thank you.
Hi, Ms. Cruz.
Hi. Great job presenting. You raised a lot of questions. I'll just get to the one. So Nelson Mandela, he didn't have the ability for freedom of speech. Our country is unique because we have our First Amendment right, and we've seen that come under attack in other countries, right? So is there an option here for speech before civil disobedience?
Absolutely, yes. And Mandela also obviously did not, the actions taken by the anti-apartheid groups led by Nelson Mandela were could not entirely be classified as civil disobedience. He engaged in acts of violent, political sabotage. And I think he was justified in doing so because the South African apartheid regime is very different from the liberal democracies in which I am discussing the right to civil disobedience. So yes, absolutely. Like I said, a well-functioning liberal democracy has opportunities for free speech and political participation through which justice should be pursued. But at some point, again, no world that we live in is perfect, and civil disobedience exists in the context of a liberal democracy, which is, again, what my paper covers, as kind of a remedy for those shortcomings. So obviously, no, your first response anytime you see something that makes you mad should not be break the law about it.
I feel better now you're going off to college with that mindset.
Mr. Dottie.
Hey, just something that the second time I've heard this presentation that just occurred to me, referring back to the suit incident with painting and the spray paint on Stonehenge, it seems to me like there's a really fine line between publicity stunt and civil disobedience. I wonder if this idea of a stunt just to gain attention would be how would you view that type of thing? And so that seems different than practicing the right. I'm thinking about Rosa Parks, practicing the right that you're actually protesting against. That seems different than something to kind of gain attention. Could you address that?
I do think there's something of a difference between protesting a law where the law is inherently unjust and more of I am violating this kind of morally neutral law to point out a greater injustice that can't be clearly defined within the law. And that was a bigger feature in an earlier draft of my paper, but at some point I do think both are viable forms of civil disobedience, and I think at some point the purpose of a lot of protests is publicity, and I don't think that's a bad thing. Like, this exists to raise awareness about a cause among the people, to make you look at this person and say, that person was willing to do this crazy thing and be arrested because they believe passionately in this. Should I care about this? What is this? And the Just Stop Oil Stunts, I can just kind of appreciate from an aesthetic angle, because I think there's something really poetic about, oh, there's such outrage about the destruction of art, but none about the destruction of the planet. So no, I think that's very well done.
Appreciate that.
Okay, Kate, you have now done your thesis presentation twice, and you did a very good job.